Today we're going to answer the question, well, Jesus is going to answer the question for those who have a desire for their life to mean something. And for me, the desire of my life is for my life to mean something. And this is a series we're doing where we're focusing on Jesus and we're calling it the Jesus way. Because there's so many things that Jesus gives us and teaches us, and there's so many lessons that we can learn from interactions that people have with Jesus. So this series is going to go on for a while where we're going to focus on Jesus and we're going to focus on the lessons that Jesus can give us because they're powerful. And we're going to talk about a very special woman who I admire very much in the Bible. She's not mentioned loads of times, but she is mentioned in every single gospel because the importance of who she is very special. And she's an inspirational woman. And she has a pattern, and the pattern that she gives us and this interaction that she has is a pattern that we can all follow and be enriched by. And it's in Mark 14, verse 3. And this is Jesus. And being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, he sat at the table, and a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. She broke the flask and poured it out on his head. And there were some there who were indignant among themselves and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done shall be told as a memorial to her." This is a very, very powerful story. And there's so many things that we can take from this interaction, this special interaction from this lady that she had with Jesus. So first of all, let's find out who she was. So we're going to work through this, Heather. If you can bring it back up after, we'll go from different scriptures, but if you can go back to it. So this woman, her name is Mary, and she's known as Mary of Bethany. And she is the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who Jesus rose from the dead. And we can find her story in this story, and we find it in Matthew, Mark, and John. And the only gospel that doesn't have this particular story in it is Luke. But Luke gives us a great insight to Mary's character and who Mary is. And Luke tells us this in 10:38. He says, "Now it happened as they went, they entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his words. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, 'Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me.' And Jesus answered and said to her, 'Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen this good part, which will not be taken away from her.'" This interaction with Jesus gives us a really good insight to who this woman was, into her character, and we can clearly see that she loved Jesus, that she was a woman of worship and admiration of Jesus. And having this deeper understanding gives us the reason why Mary broke this alabaster flask of spikenard oil and anointed Jesus. But what was the significance of this? And I have preached on this before, but these verses go so much deeper and there's so much more into it. I could not get through everything if I did a whole series on this in weeks. There's so much and such a significance in these verses. So to answer the significance of this, we need to find out what an alabaster flask of spikenard is. So spikenard was an extract that came from a flower in the north of India from the Himalayas. So from Jerusalem, or Bethany, which is just outside of Jerusalem, to the foothills of the Himalayas is a heck of a long way. It's 4,500 kilometres. And in those days where you only rode a camel or a donkey or you walked, that's a long way. And it was precious. This wasn't just a cheap perfume. This was one of the most precious substances in the ancient Near East. It was valued very highly. And in excess, it says that it was valued at over 300 denarii, which was a full year's wages or more for a person. A full year's wages. So it was Mary's entire life savings. A woman in that time would have had to work long and hard for a lifetime to save that much. It was like her life savings. It was her retirement fund. It was what she would have had to rely on in old age to see her through. And when you realise what the meaning of Bethany is, it makes it all the more special. Because Bethany means house of affliction or poorhouse. And it's most likely, and a lot of scholars believe, that this town was a town where they cared for the poor and the sick. And we see that because Lazarus died in this town. And we see that because the interaction that Mary had with Jesus is in Simon the leper's house. So it was a pretty garbagey suburb. It would have been the dregs, and everybody that lived there was not affluent. Mary would not have been a rich woman. She would not have been a woman of means. So when Mary poured out this vessel of spikenard on Jesus' head, she was pouring out everything. In worship to Jesus, she was pouring out her entire life in a time where there was no social security. There was nothing for her to fall back on. This was her life's work, and she pours it out on Jesus' head. It's of great significance. And another thing of great significance that we can see in this verse, Mark tells us that she broke the flask and poured it out. Because of the value of the contents of this flask, they would call it an alabaster box or a vessel. But what it was something that needed to be broken to get to the contents. It was so valuable that it was sealed in such a way that it would be seen if it was tampered with. So it had to be broken so you could access the contents of it. And this is significant because it represents how we come to Jesus. That when we come to Jesus, that we need to be broken. And it's the application of our lives to understand that we need to come before Jesus in a state where our hearts are broken and understanding that we are in humility and saying, Lord, I'm broken. And I love these verses. They back it up. Psalm 51:17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. Psalm 34:18. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. When we understand that we are all broken vessels, when we come to Jesus and we offer him our brokenness in humility, that's the starting point for every one of us to begin to pour our life out before him. And this is why Mary is such an inspiration to me, because she wasn't just pouring out expensive oil onto Jesus, she was pouring out her entire life. She was pouring it out. And the Apostle Paul is another one of the greatest examples of this. He is someone I admire greatly, and he poured his life out into Jesus. And Paul tells us in Philippians 2:17, yes, and I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, and I am glad and rejoice with you all. And he also says to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 12:15, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. And I love this other statement that Paul makes to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 11:1. He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This is the Jesus way. Jesus is our greatest example of someone who poured their life out to God. Mary and Paul are our examples of people who pour their life out to God. And Paul tells us this very clearly in Romans 12:1. He says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So this is why Jesus, Paul and Mary are our examples on how to live and pour our lives out as living sacrifices, which I might add is just our reasonable service. It's not anything that goes above and beyond. It's just our reasonable service to God. So we need, and I need, to study the pattern of their lives that they've given to all of us. And we see the next thing that Mary teaches us, and this lesson is given to us in verse 4. It says, but there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticised her sharply. I need to tell you that if you desire to live your life poured out in worship to Jesus, you are going to be criticised for it. You will face opposition. If you want to devote your life in service to Jesus, if you want to pour yourself out like Mary did, you're going to face opposition. It's a promise. To live your life as a living sacrifice is not easy. It's not easy. And Paul tells us this truth. He tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:12, he says, yes, and all those who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. They not might suffer persecution, they will suffer. If you desire to live your life and pour it out before Jesus, you're going to suffer persecution. And sometimes that persecution will come from those closest to you. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. Verse 6. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. When you pour your life out, to Jesus, Jesus will fight for you. When you live your life as a living sacrifice, Jesus will stand up for you. In the midst of any persecution, Jesus will be there. That's the good news. Good news, bad news is persecution's going to come. It's a guarantee. You want to live all in for Jesus? You want to pour your life out for Jesus? That persecution is going to come. I'm not going to stand here and lie to you. The more you want to live for Jesus, the harder it's going to get. But the good news is that Jesus is never going to leave you. He's never going to forsake you, and he will stand up for you. And he's the God of all creation. So Paul knew this. 2 Timothy 4:16, he says, "At my defence none stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that all the Gentiles might hear. Also, I was delivered from the mouth of a lion." Jesus stood with Paul. No matter if everyone forsakes you, Jesus will never leave you or forsake you. He's the one who fights for you. Another lesson that Jesus teaches us through Mary we find in verse 9. "Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will be told as a memorial for her." It's one of humanity's broadest desires is to be remembered. So many people work and toil their whole lives to build monuments to themselves. It's happened throughout history so that people may remember them. But this woman, with her one act of service, is remembered in all the world. Her life meant something. You know, so many people waste their time building monuments to themselves, trying to be remembered in some way. You know, it's in the back of so many people's minds. No one's going to remember me after I die. And that, for the majority of people, is the truth. In 100 years, no one's going to even remember that we were here. All the stuff that we counted so precious and the things that we tried to build to put our name on to make people remember us, they're going to be gone. It's going to be gone. The houses that we live in, the renovations that we do, the cars that we drive, it's going to be rusting in a scrap heap. Someone else is going to be living in our house and no one's going to even remember that we were here, most likely. So Jesus gives us the keys to unlocking a life lived with meaning. When we pour out our lives to Jesus, our lives will be transformed to have an eternal perspective. Paul understood this eternal perspective very well because he tells the Philippians in Philippians 3:20, "For our citizenship is in heaven, for which we also eagerly wait for the Saviour, the Lord Jesus Christ." Our citizenship is in heaven. We are not of this world. We have an eternal perspective. And Paul understood that this life was just for a moment. Paul knew that pouring out his life was eternal. And he understood the meaning of this verse in Psalm 103:15. "As for man, his days are like grass. As a flower of the field, so he flourishes. For the wind passes over it and is gone, and its place remembers it no more. But the mercies of the Lord are from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him with reverence, respect him. And his righteousness to children's children." Our lives are over with so quickly. And that is why Paul and Mary and Jesus, especially Jesus, are my example. And one of the last and greatest messages that Mary can teach us from this interaction that she had with Jesus was her motivation. The motivation for what Mary did, the motivation for pouring out her life on Jesus was love. And this can be the only motivation that makes our sacrifice of pouring our life out to Jesus worth anything. If we try and pour our life out through religious practice, through guilt or by works, if the motivation of our life to pour ourselves out to Jesus is buying our way to heaven, then it's useless. The only acceptable sacrifice to Jesus in pouring our life out is a life poured out in love. The service, the selfless act of, Jesus, I love you. Here's my life. Here it is. And that is what Mary teaches me the most. She poured out everything on Jesus because she loved him. And she loved him with such a great heart of passion. She was like, Jesus, you can have it all. She didn't look to what she had in the future, her security. She knew Jesus was her security. There's so many people and their stories in the Bible that are our example to follow. And this is not, and then their lives and what they demonstrate, like I talked about Joseph. You know, there's so many people throughout the Bible that God has put their stories in there because they are our example. They're our pattern to follow. The lives that they lived are our example. Just like the example that Jesus has given us. Jesus lived a life that is our example and our pattern of how we are to live. God himself came down and lived a life to give us an example and a pattern to follow. We've got no excuse. We can't say, you're living up there, you don't know what it's like. God himself came down and lived a life of sacrifice and poured his life out in sacrifice to us. The way he lived, he sacrificed himself for us. He poured his life out onto us. And that is why Jesus is my inspiration. That is why we're preaching on the Jesus way. And that is why the story of Mary's life is such an inspiration. This wonderful woman poured it all out. She poured it all out onto Jesus. And because she did that, because she had that eternal perspective, what she did echoes through the ages and will echo into eternity. It's the way I want my life to be spent. I want my life to be spent with an eternal purpose. I don't want to stand before Jesus and have full pockets and say, I didn't spend it all, Jesus. I didn't pour it all out, I kept it back. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about our time. I'm talking about our love. I'm talking about how we treat others. I'm talking about the eternal purpose, because this life is over with so quickly. Eternity is what is going to matter to us. Eternity is what these things that we do in this life is going to make the difference in. And I don't want to stand there before him saying, I didn't pour it out, Lord. I kept it back. I've got full pockets. And that's the danger for us all. If we don't understand the eternal perspective, if we don't understand the Jesus way, that our life is worship to him. I'm not saying that you have to become nuns or monks or go. It's the attitude of the heart that says, Jesus, you can have it all. Jesus, I'm not going to hold anything back. I'm not going to if you speak to me, I'll give it. If you ask me, I'll go. That's the eternal perspective. That's the attitude that we need to have. That's the attitude that I want to have. And that's pouring your life out. And I love that story of Mary of Bethany. What a woman. What a woman. And she just didn't hold back. She just gave it all.
It was my girlfriend and I. We went to a music festival. And we've been to music festivals before, and we do what we do, and we had drugs. The doctor that was in charge of emergency that night, they moved us into a room and she sat me down, and she told me, "Tan, you need to call her family because she's not going to make it through the night." Getting this news is it's tough. Getting this, hearing this news, it's a bit tough, and I'm in the waiting room and I'm just crying, and I went downstairs and I went to the front desk and asked them, "Is there a chapel here?" I went into the chapel and I put my hands together and I just prayed. I didn't know what I was saying. I was like, "Dear God, it's Tan. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please help her." I had a friend of mine who goes to church, and she came to the hospital several times actually to come and visit me. She came to visit me on Saturday, and we were sitting in the chapel praying and just sitting there talking. And she told me, "I'm doing something next Wednesday called Alpha. You should come." And I asked her, "What's that?" She goes, "Don't worry too much about it. There's going to be dinner." I said, "You know what, I will. I'll be there." My first experience coming to Alpha, I remember driving. I was a bit nervous. I didn't know what I was really coming here for. I'm seeing all these people walk in there as well, and I'm like, they're all normal people. I said, "I'm Tan, I'm here for Alpha." T invited me. She goes, "Oh, welcome." Everyone's like, "Hi, welcome, welcome, welcome." And I had a fantastic group. I actually had a fantastic group that made me feel very, very relaxed and comfortable, and I was able to speak from the heart as well and just tell them my story. And they weren't judgmental. They were nothing like me. They were not judgmental or anything, and it was filled with love, and they were just so supportive of everything. I went straight to hospital and I saw her. She's awake, and I'm crying. I'm hysterical. She has no idea why I'm crying. And I went straight back to the chapel and I prayed to God. I said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And that was just amazing, seeing her up, seeing her, waking up and everything. To me, Alpha means love. Alpha absolutely means love. And I've learned through Alpha how loving God is, how forgiving He was. So after everything I've done in my life, every bad thing I've done in my life, and what happened recently as well, because I blamed myself for what happened recently. But just to feel love from everyone, I feel love from God, feeling loved and being forgiven. That's when I knew I wanted to give my life to Christ. If I was to invite somebody to Alpha, I think one of the things I would ask them is, where are you right now with your life? I honestly think, do you feel helpless at the moment? Do you feel there's nothing left? Because I think Alpha will be great. It'll be a great start. That's what I personally think.